Welcome to St. Petersburg, city in Russia established by Peter the Great, Tsar Peter I as his imperial capital. A city that was built entirely from scratch. In the second part of our series on Russia's former imperial cities, we explore the cultural capital of the country and the legacy of the Romanovs, from Peter the Great to Nicholas II, the last Tsar. We're joining Trafalgar in St. Petersburg to experience the opulence, extravagance, and aristocratic charm of the former Tsarist capital on Europe's northwestern edge. So join us, I'm David Celdran in St. Petersburg, and this is Executive Class. Do svidaniya, goodbye Moscow, and allo St. Petersburg. Traveling from the capital in the center of Russia to St. Petersburg on the Baltic Coast has never been as easy now that a brand new bullet train can cover the journey across the vast Russian countryside in just 3.5 hours. Though only 365 kilometers separate both cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg are like worlds apart. The former is Slavic and Soviet in temperament, the latter imperial and European in character. Just as it was intended and designed by Peter the Great, its founder. Driving through the elegant streets of St. Petersburg today, it's hard to believe this was once swampland. Not a problem for Tsar Peter, however, who wanted to move his empire's capital closer to Western Europe in every way. The westernizing Tsar hired Italian architects to create his urban master plan, with a visionary rectangular grid pattern of streets, parks, and squares that predate any in the West. Established in 1703, the founder's vision remains alive more than 3 centuries later. A cityscape of spectacular symmetry and urban harmony, expanded and embellished by every Tsar and Empress since Peter. We're on our way to the village of Pushkin in the outskirts of the city to visit the palace named after Peter's wife, Catherine, who commissioned the original building. Wealthy Russians have a habit of keeping a summer residence in the countryside, or a dacha as they call it. It's probably a habit they picked up from their tsars and nobles. Well, this dacha, or summer residence, more like a palace actually, is the grandest of them all. And here is where generations of Romanovs lived. The flamboyant Rococo Catherine's Palace was the imperial family's summer residence, but it's just as resplendent in winter when the snow covers its grand courtyard and gardens. Robin egg blue and white edifice and gilded stucco facade are striking even in gloomy weather, though it's a humble shell compared to the palace's opulent interiors. After ascending the grand staircase, visitors will be awestruck by the sumptuously decorated ballroom. The vast gilded and mirror-lined hall witnessed the imperial family's infamously lavish parties and masquerades. Though named after her namesake, it was Empress Catherine the Great who left the largest imprint on the palace and its most controversial secrets. Yes, the luxurious rooms and precious antiques are amazing, but more so the tales of trysts with lovers and plots against enemies that happened here. Stories told and retold in endless dramas and documentaries about Catherine. Indeed, the Romanovs lived large, and the rooms they occupied and the possessions they left behind attest to their lavish spirit. And if there's one hall that will convince you of their excessive extravagance, it's this. The so-called amber room, made completely out of amber, the rare and precious stone. Sadly, all this was looted and destroyed by the retreating German army after the siege of the city, But thanks to meticulous research and the financial support of patrons and tourists, the Romanovs' summer palace has been restored to its former glory. Grand as it seems, Catherine's palace was more like a holiday home, because the true seat of power resided at the Hermitage on the banks of the Neva River. Known then as the Winter Palace, the massive residence of Tsar St. Peter was converted into a state museum after the Russian Revolution and the return of the capital to Moscow. The art collection Catherine the Great once displayed here for her own satisfaction has grown to become the world's largest, with over 3 million artifacts and artworks. But I'll save that tour for later. Indeed, it seems like the Romanov Tsars were incapable of restraint, even with religion. Unlike Roman Catholics who considered the Pope God's representative on earth, for Russian Orthodox Christians, it was the Tsar. And that meant there was little the church in Moscow could do to stop the westernizing and liberalizing ways of the Tsars in St. Petersburg. The massive St. Isaac's Cathedral, built by Tsar Alexander I, boasts the largest dome in Russia. The imperial church dwarfed the seat of the Russian Patriarchate in Moscow. A reminder indeed of who was in charge of religious matters here. St. Isaac's was another sign of the westernizing times, and indeed, it sometimes feels less like a traditional Russian Orthodox church and a bit more like an Italian cathedral. Even the building's bronze doors with sculpted reliefs were patterned after those of Ghiberti's baptistery in Florence. The Tsar also chose a French architect, Auguste de Montferrand, to build St. Isaac's, a controversial choice for such an important symbol of Russian culture. And like the Italianate palaces the Romanovs built all over the city, St. Isaac's would have looked foreign to most Russians back then, with a stained glass icon of Jesus Christ above the altar, a radical medium for an Orthodox church at least. As with most churches in the city named Leningrad after the Bolshevik victory, St. Isaac's was converted into a museum by the communist regime. The Soviet era is over, and the city is no longer called Leningrad, but citizens still argue whether to keep it as a public museum or return the cathedral to the Orthodox Church. Indeed, the imperial churches of St. Petersburg are so beautiful, locals prefer to keep them as public monuments, and the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood is definitely the most precious of them. Although the Tsars and Tsarinas of Russia were westernizers, their reforms just weren't good enough for an increasingly revolutionary segment of Russian society. And so Alexander II, Tsar Alexander II, was actually a reformer. He abolished serfdom in Russia, was assassinated on this spot where his church now stands. And it's one of the most beautiful churches in St. Petersburg. The dull light and fog obscure the brilliance of this splendid structure. But the interiors, lit with chandeliers and glistening mosaics, remind us why this is one of the world's most breathtakingly beautiful churches. The UNESCO World Heritage Site was built on the very spot where Tsar Alexander II was attacked by radicals. It's been said, had this reformer lived, his policies may have prevented a revolution altogether. Yes, perhaps, though it would have also denied us of this magnificent memorial. The church, designed in Russian medieval style, contains over 7,500 square meters of mosaics, the most there is in Europe. No space, no corner is left untouched by the illuminated artworks, bejeweled panels, and gilded decor. It's unbelievable. The church once served as a makeshift morgue in World War II, an indoor vegetable market in the post-war Soviet regime. Today, it's a museum and memorial to a fallen Tsar and to a dynasty with a legacy that's being reassessed by Russians across the country. Many of whom make their way to the Peter and Paul fortress on the island where the Romanov Tsar founded the city. and to its imperial cathedral, where he, Peter the Great, is buried, along with the leading members of the dynasty. Peter was the original westernizer, and his new capital's cathedral, built in Italian Baroque style, was unlike any Russians had known. Although the grand iconostasis, the wall of icons and paintings, is typically Russian Orthodox, the legacy of a family torn between its modern Western tastes and ancient Russian sensibilities. The white marble tomb of Peter, Tsar and military commander, is a pilgrimage site for army officers. Another popular Romanov, the assassinated Tsar Alexander II, is entombed here as well, beside his German wife, Maria Alexandrovna. So too is Alexander III, the last Tsar Nicholas II's father, and his mother, the Danish princess Maria Fedorovna. A recent addition to the cathedral are the tombs of Nicholas II and his family, who were executed by Bolsheviks in 1918. Hidden for decades, the remains were exhumed after the end of the Soviet Union in 1991 and buried at the Romanov dynasty's final resting place 7 years later. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were all later canonized as Russian saints.
It's really ironic, isn't it? Indeed, one of the greatest ironies of Russian history, that the Romanov imperial dynasty, deposed and murdered by the communists, and now interred here at the church. They're now revered once again by a segment of the Russian population.
Up next, we'll wrap up our journey in Russia with a taste of St. Petersburg's cultural treasures and gastronomic delights. A final look at the country's artistic capital when Executive Class returns after the break.